Jean Grey is killing the universe in Marvel Comics. So we are back with the Phoenix comic, and it's a little bit of cleanup duty because we kind of stopped in the middle of a story arc. We got distracted with Storm. Where we ended up leaving off with the Phoenix comic was that essentially Jean Grey had to make a choice between collapsing a black hole in on itself, saving countless lives, or stopping a villain named Perrikus. Ultimately, she chose to focus on the black hole. The result was that Perrikus landed on a world that belonged to a young girl named Adani. He killed Adani's father and then tricked Adani into believing that the Phoenix was the one who did it. After that, Adani kind of became this Anakin Skywalker type character where, following the path that was laid out for her by Perrikus, she started going to places like the God Quarry, basically locations where you can attain immense levels of power. And then she went to challenge Jean Grey. And due to Jean's empathy, the desire to kind of see things from Adani's perspective, Jean bestowed a portion of her power onto Adani, who in that moment turned on Jean. And then you end up finding out that the goal of Perrikus overall, for even doing all of that in the first place, was to basically make it possible for the Dark Gods to begin infecting the main Marvel Universe. The Dark Gods basically being these like antithesis type characters to Asgardians, right? So imagine evil Asgardians. Those are the Dark Gods. And that kind of leads us to where we are now, because you kind of get this bit of a final battle, where on one hand, you have Jean Grey facing off against all these Dark Gods, and then on the other hand, you have Adani, who's basically being used by the Dark Gods to bring the Shadow Realm of the Dark Gods themselves into the main Marvel Universe, and then really kind of move on from there and infect the entire multiverse. Now, this is not the destruction of the universe that I'm talking about, right? Kind of bringing an end to everything. Again, we're just doing a little bit of cleanup duty here. But by and large, things kind of go the way that you would, with this basically being the conclusion of the previous story, which is to say, Perrikus in his hubris and being a dark god that kind of represents the very nature of what it means to be powerful, despite not being one of the most powerful beings in existence, right? It's more of a title he holds. He is incredibly powerful, but he underestimates Jean and her empathy, because the reality here is that the Phoenix Force is capable of complete and utter destruction, and destruction is a part of its role. But with death also comes life, and that's why Jean Grey oftentimes harps on the idea that as the Phoenix, she represents what it means to live, to create life. Because after something's destroyed, the Phoenix doesn't just kind of dust its hands off and walk away, right? A new thing is born out of that. And so that's why each one of these dark gods in turn, using powers of illusion, different things like that, each try to step up and stop Jean Grey. But because of the fact that she's channeling the power of the Phoenix, and because the Phoenix, of course, operates on a multiversal level, Jean Grey defeats each and every one of them and then seemingly sends them to other realities, or at least some of them. And so that's why she says, I know exactly what they're doing. First to Kotz, and then to Chell, and then Slototh, right? They want to slow me down, while Adani, imbued with the Phoenix Force, acts as their vessel, distributing pieces of the Shadow Realm to every part of this universe and others. But I can play that game too. And so she says one moment can cause a massive ripple throughout the entire universe. There is the moment before I threw the Frisbee, and the moment after I threw the Frisbee. Of course, basically hearkening back to her story with Annie. Annie, of course, being her childhood friend who was hit by a car and killed. In that moment, Jean Grey's telepathy woke up, and then she experienced Annie's dying moments. That kind of goes into her connection with the Phoenix and how she first became a mutant in Marvel Comics. But she says two moments, separated only by seconds, that reflect two different versions of my world. There was the moment before I chose to save a prison over stopping Perrikus, and the moment after. And then there is this moment, the moment Perrikus expects me to choose Adani over stopping him, and he's right. I will choose her, an innocent mortal dragged into the affairs of gods, a child whose course in life was, in just one moment, completely changed. But so like a god, Perrikus is filled with hubris. He sees my empathy as weakness, but he so quickly forgets I have never been afraid to burn. And so literally what happens is Jean Grey reaches out and touches Adani and takes that portion of the Phoenix Force back, along with seemingly all the power that Adani has gained. And so she says, in just one moment, everything can change, not with fear or destruction, but with light, with life. This is not about gods or about their games, but the kind of hope that they could never begin to understand, and a kind of power that is not used to rule, but to fight for every world and every soul on every planet and in every multiverse, all to prove that sometimes all it takes is a spark. And so with Jean Grey using the full totality of the Phoenix Force, she destroys Perrikus and all the remaining dark gods, right? They're wiped away. And then she approaches Adani. And what's really fascinating about this is that Adani's entire story up to this point was a feeling of helplessness, right? The loss of her father, the loss of everything that she knew and loved. And so the idea of gaining all this power, even if she was being tricked into using it for nefarious purposes, and due to the sheer amount of power that she had gained, suddenly basically being overcome with some may argue to be some measure of insanity, the fact is that Jean Grey approaches her and says, at the end of the day, yes, you have lost all this power that you had before, the power of the God Quarry, which is basically an unlimited source of power, but it only really becomes a plot device, right? It just gives people whatever power they need to accomplish their goal at any point in time in Marvel Comics. What she's terrified of is at the end of the day going back and just being as helpless as she was before. But not before she asked the question to Jean Grey. She says, can you undo it? And Jean asks what she's talking about. And she says, can you undo what Perrikus has done? Bring back my father and take me home. And Jean says, that is not my purpose. I oversee the cycles of life and death, but interfering, restoring life where it was taken, the universe exists in balance, Adani. I have lost my own family, and believe me, there is not a day that goes by where I don't think about my parents and about my sister. I miss them and I love them, and I honor their memories by maintaining the universe to the best of my abilities. That is the way of the light. Now, there is an important distinction to understand here, and there's an important thing to grasp here, that when it comes to Jean Grey's statement and saying, I oversee the cycles of life and death, this is, again, kind of death and rebirth. And it's one of the things to keep in mind about like cosmic entities in Marvel. Oftentimes, people who are not overly familiar with cosmic entities within Marvel Comics, they constantly try to find these kind of lines of demarcation, right? Like there has to be some absolute barrier that separates Mistress Death from like the Phoenix Force. But the reality here is there's a lot of overlap between the cosmic entities. It's a very, very messy landscape that's constantly in a state of flux. In fact, right now, the cosmic entity landscape is in a state of flux in the Storm comics. So you're never really going to find this instance where there are just like these clear lines of delineation between what one cosmic entity does and what another does, what one stands for versus what another stands for. There used to be clear lines, but those clear lines have been blurred over the last few decades, truth to tell. And so what ends up happening is that Adani says, I choose light. And in that moment, she kind of snaps back to her younger self. And that's the cool thing about this, because what ends up happening is that the entire world of Adani comes back. Everything manifests. Now, initially, we're kind of left to ask the question, who initially did this? Adani with what little vestiges of power that she had left, or Jean Grey herself, despite saying that is not her role? But we actually get a little bit of clarification here in her conversation with Richard Rider, because she says, this moon will serve as a sanctuary to anyone who has been harmed or displaced by the higher powers of the universe, a place where children can just be children. And it is protected by me. And the response of Richard Rider is, I can't believe you built it this fast, Jean. At least I can, but it's still impressive. So clearly it was done by Jean. And Jean doesn't really deny this, right? She doesn't say, well, it wasn't me. She's just kind of like, so here's the thing, like, I need some allies. Like, I love the fact that you guys help me with that. The reality here is that I have a role to play in the cosmos as the Phoenix, but I could certainly use some people with their ears to the ground, kind of keeping me aware of things that I otherwise wouldn't notice. Now, that's a huge plot point for the story, and it's very easy to be dismissive of it, but one of the things that Stephanie Phillips has kind of crafted here is this story where Jean Grey kind of embracing the Phoenix as opposed to viewing it as this part of her history that she would rather forget due to some of the travesties that were committed during her time as the Dark Phoenix, that with her now operating out there in the cosmos, almost in the same capacity as someone like Quasar, right, or something like that, that there's a lot of things that happen out in the universe. Like if I asked you right now, what's happening in Shanghai, China right now on like this one street with this one family, you wouldn't be able to answer that question, right? Even if I gave you a name and an address, or you couldn't give me an answer to that question because it's all the way over there. And for the Phoenix, it's the same way. That while Jean does have things like cosmic awareness, she's not always paying attention to everything that's happening all at once. And so it's a way for Stephanie Phillips to establish she is kind of out there doing her own thing, but some things are going to slip through the cracks. So team-ups are in the future. And so what ends up happening is that as she takes off and kind of does her own thing, she's suddenly contacted by her sister, Sara. Now, one of the things that I've seen online in the aftermath of Sara Gray's return in Marvel Comics is a lot of people are confused because a lot of people didn't even know that Sara existed in Marvel Comics, and she does. This is not a retcon, right? Sara has existed. It's simply Stephanie Phillips bringing her back. So here's a bit of a crash course in Sara Gray. So Sara Gray herself is somewhat of a retcon in Marvel Comics from the old Chris Claremont days. Bizarre Adventures number 27, something that we've mentioned before, was the first real origin of Jean in Marvel. Sara Gray was mentioned in that, but a lot of that kind of came in the aftermath of the death of Jean Grey and Marvel's intention to bring her character back. So for about 2 or 3 months before Jean Grey's return in the Avengers and the Fantastic Four comics, leading into her full-on return in X-Factor number 1, Marvel was doing a lot of heavy lifting, kind of crafting these retcon stories, these new backstories for Jean, in order to kind of build up this sort of mythos for her character outside of whatever we had seen during her time in the original Stan Lee, Jack Kirby days, the Arnold Drake, Roy Thomas, and Gary Friedrich days, and then of course the Chris Claremont days going into his 17-year run. But one of the things to know is that Sara was not an overly significant character. She was there, and she was the sister of Jean, but outside of that, it wasn't really until you got into X Factor from Louise Simonson and Mark Silvestri, who was actually drawing it at that point in time, that Sara was basically somebody who had operated as a friend to the mutant population, right? Just kind of somebody who was very vocal about mutant rights, and then just vanished. Specifically, that happened in X Factor number 12, like she quite literally disappeared alongside her husband, Paul, and it wasn't until about 4 years after that in the Phalanx Covenant storyline from X-Men Volume 2, issue number 36, kind of a follow-up from the Extinction Agenda storyline for Cameron Hodge, where you basically learn that Cameron Hodge, who is now possessed by the Phalanx Covenant, right? This kind of cybernetic entity out there that's always looking to absorb beings into itself, that he had essentially killed, or at least had Sara killed, at some point in time. Now, we didn't really know when that happened, and in fact, Sara's appearance in that comic is really more just Cameron Hodge manifesting her physical appearance out of his belly in order to like taunt the X-Men, and that's it. It wasn't until much later on in Uncanny X-Men issue number 466, in the aftermath of House of M, specifically the Rachel Summers storyline where she went to go visit like the last of the Greys or learn about the last of the Greys, that you end up seeing some kind of return to the character of Sara Gray. But this is like the full-on return of her character in Marvel under Stephanie Phillips. The funny thing about this is that what Stephanie Phillips is about to do is she's actually going to bring back the original intention of Chris Claremont for Sara Gray before Marvel screwed up all of his plans. And so what ends up happening is that when Jean Grey is met by the arrival of Sara, once Jean Grey actually goes to see her, she initially spends time in the white hot room. But when she finally encounters Sara, she doesn't actually think that Sara's real, right? Because Sara's dead, right? Seemingly been dead for quite some time. But before you actually figure out what's going on there, you jump to Cable. Why? Because Cable's a retcon machine, right? Whenever Marvel has an event that they want to do, and they want to like change the present, right? Cable's just going to like jump from the future into the modern day. Don't do that. You're going to break the future, right? That's Cable's whole shtick in Marvel Comics. But the cool thing about this is what he's talking about here is kind of the same thing that Jean Grey was explaining, that there was a kind of sudden surge of energy of sorts, a kind of dampening, right? The universe itself, quote unquote, grown. And so that's why Cable asked the question, have you ever felt the entire universe groan under the weight of change, a weight so crushing it could be felt from years and years into the future. And where he's initially kind of dealing with these criminal guys, doing his own thing, it doesn't really matter to him, right? Because what he's realized here is something has happened in the past, and it's sending out cascading effects. It's like an explosion in the ocean 1,000 miles that way. And the tidal wave that's careening toward you right now, that's literally change rippling across the time stream. It will catch up to cable, and it will change everything. But that's one of the great things about cable having time slide technology, is he can operate outside of time. And that's exactly what he does, right? He's like, there is a cascading wave that is heading here, and it's about to eradicate everything, right? Change this entire future. So he literally time slides a few hundred years into the past and back to the present day. And so at that point, you switch back over to Jean and Sara. And that's kind of the funny thing, is that Jean's like, I'm afraid to say anything, right? Because I'm afraid that if I do, it'll turn out this is all a dream, that none of it's real. And Sara tells her, use your powers, use your ability to control reality or to read my mind or whatever, and you tell me if I'm real. And that's where Jean realizes Sara's real. She's very much actually here. And it's kind of nuts because she's overwhelmed with emotion, right? She's kind of crushed by the fact that her sister has seemingly been trying to reach out to her all this time, and that she's never been able to get a hold of Jean, and that Jean had no idea that she was doing that. So there's some feeling, right, of negligence on behalf of Jean Grey regarding her sister. But what you end up finding out is that Sara is running this thing called Greyhaven, right? And she says, all these people that are here, all these individuals you see here, they're mutants. And they came here, right? There are people who have come to me searching for help. And the question that Jean asks is like, what kind of help? And Sara just says, mutant help. Everyone here is a mutant, Jean, just ones with latent powers. Mutants who have always known that they were different, but have been unable to unlock that part of their minds. And she says, that's my latent mutant ability, to unlock someone's full potential. Now, Comic Book Resources had a really good article about this, where they were addressing the idea of what Chris Claremont wanted to do with Sara. That was his plan, right? To make her a member of X Factor and to give her the ability to wake up mutant powers, right? Those powers that simply hadn't activated yet. So it is cool to see Stephanie Phillips bringing all this in. But she says, I looked for everyone, Jean, my kids, Paul, mom, and dad, and I realized I'm the last one left, or at least I was, until I found you. And that's the other part of the equation, that ultimately the children of Sara were killed, but her husband Paul just vanished from Marvel Comics, never to be seen or heard from again, right? Marvel just stopped writing him one day. And that's it, right? But again, the conversation goes on. She says, I found you in the white hot room when I could not establish our psychic link. There are many psychics here, though none as powerful as Phoenix, and together they helped me meet you at the doors to the white hot room itself. But when I found you, something went wrong. I didn't know what else to do, Jean, so I removed your consciousness and brought you back here with me. And I have to admit, I'm excited to show you the family that I finally built here. And so the big question that's kind of lingering out there is, when did she come back? And if she did, how? Right? How in the world did that happen? And so what you end up doing is picking up in what's called year 11 of the Thale Civil War. Right? Now, we're not really given any particular point in time outside of just year 11 of this war. We don't know if it's an alternate reality, because when you're dealing with the White Hot Room exists outside the multiverse. So anyone in the multiverse can access it if they have enough power or they're brought there by the Phoenix. And so what you end up doing is picking up with a guy by the name of Kel, who's just kind of exploring this entire area. And of course, there's little sensors that go out due to this ship crash landing down here and then looking to see if there's any kind of life here, and no life's detected. But then they find footprints, and then they simply just find Sara standing there. And she says, my name is Sara Grey, and I was never extraordinary. I was born into a world filled with mutants. Kids my own age develop powers unlike anything the world had ever seen before. Kids like my own sister, Jean. I was there when her telepathic powers activated. I was there when she became trapped in her mind and in constant psychic pain. I watched my parents struggle to help her and at times lose hope that there was any path forward. And yet, if I'm being totally honest, despite all the pain, confusion, and anger, I often used to think about how different my life would have been if it were me, if I were the one who had superpowers. What kind of hero would I have been? And so following that, of course, you get a kind of flashback conversation between Jean and Sara, where Jean just almost kind of borderline yells at Sara for basically throwing the baseball game, right? She's like, you've hit that hit a million times. There's no reason why you shouldn't have hit it before. But Sara kind of lets on, right? That the pitcher on the other team, that Sara had overheard her mom talking about how that girl was going to be moving. And so essentially Sara was just doing her a solid, right? She didn't want her to like move away, having lost the last game that she played in that particular town. More so than that, she kind of continues on as she wakes up with Kel and really kind of tries to answer what few questions that they ask her. And she says, I remember speaking on television, the bright lights. I remember Paul, my husband, was worried about it, worried that speaking out would make me a target. And she says, I was worried too. Anti-mutant hate was the norm. And when bad things happened to mutants and their sympathizers, everyone was willing to look the other way. I was a mother, a wife, a regular person, just trying to make it through the day. But that's why I had to say something. And she says, because if the regular people say nothing, that's when hate truly wins. And if it was not an anti-mutant hate group called the Purifiers trying to rid the world of mutants, it was someone else allowing fear to dictate their decision-making. The Purifiers were so afraid of losing control, of being wrong with the world changing around them, that they were willing to make a deal with the devil. And that's when you find out the Purifiers had allied themselves with Cameron Hodge. And that Cameron Hodge, again, basically working with the Phalanx Covenant, that he had essentially used the Phalanx in order to start basically modifying and absorbing various mutants. And so that's why she says Hodge's goal of mutant extermination only seemed that much more achievable when he encountered the Phalanx, a techno-organic species that lives to assimilate the people and technologies of other planets. Hodge saw this as a way to purify his mutant problem. The Phalanx technology would reprogram all of Earth's mutants, wiping them from existence and adding the mutants to the collective hive mind of the Phalanx. Now, it is important to understand that at this point in time in Cameron Hodge's history, where he initially was kind of like the publicity guy, right, the PR man for X Factor under Walter and Louise Simonson, that he was actually anti-mutant and was really working behind the scenes to destroy the reputation of the mutant population and to figure out a way to destroy them. All that came to a head with Extinction Agenda back in the 1990s. And then you followed that up with the Phalanx Covenant. So it was kind of the return of Cameron Hodge to a degree. But again, she says, I don't regret standing up for mutant rights. And I don't do it just because Jean is my sister. I did it because it was the right thing to do. And I learned from Jean that the right thing to do is not always easy. And so literally, this organism bonds with Sara, and then suddenly she wakes up in the ship that's crash landing down. The last thing she remembers is the Phalanx telling her Jean Grey had died. And that was it, right? So again, we don't necessarily know how it is that she's come back here. We simply just get her perspective from these various set of events. Because one of the first things she does in the presence of Kel is she uses her powers to wake up the powers of Kel, latent mutant abilities that he never knew he had, which seemingly come in the form of concussive blast. We're not really given a clear explanation of what he can do, and honestly, doesn't really seem overly important. It's simply just establishing what she's capable of, and that's how Kel joined her side and became her most trusted lieutenant. What's crazy is that in the middle of this whole backstory that she's giving to Jean Grey, Cable shows up and shoots her, blows this girl away, and he literally tells Jean, I need you to understand your own lie, or else I will have to make you understand. Because with knowledge from the future, Cable is almost like this guy who knows everything. Because immediately he starts firing off blasts at Jean Grey with the intention of getting to Sara. And of course, Jean is protecting Sara, and while Jean knows that Cable is not really her biological child, right, he's the child of Cyclops and Madeline Pryor, in a lot of ways, she's kind of taken him as her own, right, where she wouldn't necessarily refer to him as her son, but he might as well be with regards to how she treats him, right? He's a member of the Grey family. But he even tells Jean, right, I'm here for her, the imposter claiming to be Sara Grey. I am not here for you. Now, of course, when Kel jumps in and basically gets the upper hand on Cable, if only momentarily, Cable manages to subdue Kel, but then suddenly Kel's powers shut down, and then Cable doesn't have the ability to move. And so Jean literally locked their abilities away and was like, for the time being, you guys are going to give us an explanation. And that's where Cable tells her, Sara's not real. Right? She's not actually your sister, right? She's as real as a memory, sure, but she's not the real thing, not in the way that you are real. And where Jean is just kind of like, no, that's not true at all, right? The response of Cable, you're letting your emotions cloud your ability to see this for what it really is. And he's like, I'm sorry about this, Red, but it's the only way. And he tells his computer, initiate dampeners and begin time slide, because that's effectively going to neutralize Jean's powers. And then he immediately grabs Jean Grey and then takes her through a time slide portal and then brings her into the future. And he just tells her, this is the only possibility if you continue to deny the truth about Sara Grey, because this future is a future of death and destruction. The landscape is a hellscape. And so that's why Jean says, if Sara was lying about what and who she is, I would know and I would feel it. And Cable is just like, she's not lying. And that's where Jean's like, what are you talking about, man? Like, you're telling me she's not Sara, and then I'm telling you that she is, because if she was lying, I would know. And then you tell me she's not lying. And so she's like, something here doesn't make sense. Like, what are you talking about? And that's where Cable says, a psychic blast was sent throughout the universe that was so powerful, even I could feel it in the future. It was like the entire timeline shuddered. And I don't suppose that you would know anything about that. And the only thing that Jean really says here is she says, I sent out a wave of psychic energy to keep the powers of the dark gods from spreading, right? They were using the nexus of reality to try to bring the shadow realm into the multiverse, but like, that's not related to Sara or an apocalyptic future filled with monsters. I stopped all of that. And that's where Cable kind of gives this offhanded remark, right? He's like, it's a bad day when I have to be the one to connect the dots for the Phoenix. And that's where Jean Grey starts to realize what's going on, that it really isn't Sara, that Jean Grey created Sara. She literally just brought her into existence, most likely by her subconscious. And that's where she says, when I sent out the wave, I connected myself to the universe, putting a piece of myself in the stars. And Cable says, and Sara Grey is the personification of that energy, that link that you established. And now her existence is killing the universe. So you know what it is that you have to do. Because if you don't stop her, everything's going to come to an end. And the response of Jean, not a chance, right? Like, she's my sister, right? My psychic energy may have brought her into existence, but she does exist. She is a real person. And that's where Cable's like, I mean, I never said that she wasn't real. I simply said she was not the real Sara Grey. And that's where Jean kind of has a hard time accepting the reality of something. And it does kind of bring in a moral question, right? I mean, if Jean just kind of willed a memory of her sister into existence, but that memory can think for itself, it can feel, it can function, it has its own emotions, is it every real as a sentient human being, right? Is it an actual real person? Or if it's just a memory given form, can you just destroy it on a whim? What's the answer to that question, right? What defines a living being? And so she says, she already died once, and I will not let that happen again. There must be a way to prevent this future and keep Sara. And the response of Cable, she's not a pet, right? And she's not supposed to exist. But that's where Jean just says, like, but she does. Whether she's supposed to exist or not is irrelevant. She does exist. She's a living, breathing human being built from my love and longing for Sara. None of that is her fault. Now, it is a really interesting quagmire there, right? Because the same thing can be said for kids. No child asks to be brought into the world, yet they are brought into the world by their parents for whatever reason their parents rationalized for bringing their kid into the world in the first place. And so now that kid has to navigate the world. And there's all kind of philosophical arguments you can make there, right? But the fact is, it's almost kind of like the same thing, right? Jean Grey birthed Sara into existence, and now Sara's a sentient being. And so at the end of the day, Cable says, sure, it's not her fault, but the death of the universe will be if you do not act. She is an anomaly, and the universe does not take kindly to those genes. She's a fracture in reality that will just keep growing and spreading, destroying everything and everyone that you love. And so Jean lashes out. She's like, you really expect me to kill my sister? And the response of Cable, that's the difference between the two of us. I would be willing to do it. And in fact, he did. Cable was constantly at war with his clone Strife and trying to kill him, right? But again, two completely different eras and two completely different upbringings. And so it kind of goes back and forth, right? The banter just continues on, back and forth and back and forth. And so where Jean says, you're acting apathetic, but even you couldn't do it when you had the chance. When you first arrived, you shot Sara and stunned her instead of killing her. And the response of Cable, well, maybe I knew better than to awaken the Dark Phoenix by gunning down her sister. I'm trying to prevent one apocalypse, not start another one. If you would just focus your senses for a moment, I know that you will feel that something in this universe is wrong. And that's where Jean's just like the white hot room, right? It's connected to the very spine of the entire universe. And the white hot room was falling apart all around me, Nathan, and I ignored it. I ignored the signs, ignored that Sara never asked about her kids or Paul, her husband. I ignored the inaccuracies in her story. And that's why Cable says, I mean, you acted the way anybody would act in this situation, but you are not just anybody, Jean. And Jean acknowledges that, right? She accepts that reality, right? She is the Phoenix. And so at that point, you switch back over to Sara, right? And Sara just says, like, she's my sister, and I've lost her again. And there's a kind of back and forth, right? Like, you guys said that she would be here, right? You said that you brought us to the location where she would be. And at the end of the day, Jean's not. Clearly, of course, her and Cable have moved on to some other place. And so that's where Kel is like, you know, maybe she is here, but she's here at a different point in time. She could be 5 seconds ahead of us. She could be 1 second ahead of us, for all we know, right? I mean, that's how time works. And he says, before they left, that man said something about a time slide. Vex and Ro brought us to the right place, but at the wrong time. And that's where this voice comes out of nowhere and says, very astute for a mortal. Jean Grey is in the future, a future where all the universe is in ruin because of you, only for us to find out the person talking is the in-betweener, who in turn touches Sara Grey and says, I think that it's time that we had a conversation. I don't know what's going on at Marvel, guys, but they're coming out of the woodwork with cosmic entities. I have never seen this many cosmic entities gathered around stories in Marvel Comics since the days of like Infinity Gauntlet, Infinity War, and Marvel's collapse of the multiverse. So it's kind of wild. Anyway, let me know what you guys think down in the comments section. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, drop a like. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.